Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Neil Benson. I'm based in Brisbane, Australia. It's just after 8 o'clock in the morning here. I've had one cup of coffee. I've got my crazy professor outfit on. I'll explain some of that later, perhaps. What I'd like to share with you today is my approach for estimating business applications. It's a little bit different probably to the approach you might use today. It's worked really well for me for the last 15 years. I've been refining this approach. I have another business called Superware where we use it, and Superware actually won 2 projects late last year. There we go. So we won $2 million projects late last year, which we're delivering at the moment based on this estimation approach. So I wanted to share it with you. We're just going to cover it really quickly today. The content is actually available in a free training course called Estimating Business Applications, which you can join from my website. I'll share that with you in a moment. But one thing we do is when we think about discovery, this idea of getting to know the requirements a little bit better so that you can estimate them a bit more accurately for our customer. I've been in projects where that's a 3-month phase. In one case, working alongside Microsoft Consulting Services, at a bank in London, it was 18 months of discovery, lots of documentation. At the end of that, there was no working software. The users were absolutely no better off. All we'd done is produce reams and reams of requirement specifications and design documents. My teams today do a few hours of discovery. In fact, I've just booked a discovery day with a customer. They're not-for-profit here in Brisbane, pretty small organization, and we're going to do 9:30 and we'll finish at 3:30, and that's the discovery. The next time we meet with them, it'll be to begin development. I don't think spending a lot of time in discovery is a worthwhile investment. So I wanted to share with you how my teams accurately, confidently, and pretty quickly estimated and won those 2 projects. Are you ready for that? So quick introduction. Like I said, I'm Neil. You can connect with me on the socials. I've got Customery Academy, which is my online training and coaching business. I've got Amazing Apps, which is all my free content. I've got a podcast and a YouTube channel. If you enjoy listening to podcasts, I've got 140 episodes. Would love to have some of you on, sharing your stories about how you build amazing applications, whether you use an agile approach or something else. We love hearing customer stories, partner stories, with people using an interesting approach. Like I said, the course is Estimating Business Apps, and you'll find that at customery.academy. There's 2 questions that our stakeholders, at least my stakeholders, always ask me before we start a project, and that's how much is it going to cost and how long is it going to take? I bet you your stakeholders have asked similar questions as well. To answer those questions really accurately and precisely requires you to have an uncanny ability to predict the future. Most of us don't have that kind of forecasting capability. I bet you my crystal balls are much smaller than Aidan's crystal balls. And the software industry, as a collective, we're pretty bad. We're renowned for really, really bad at estimating the answers to those 2 questions, almost as badly as the construction industry, if anybody's ever had any building work done. But the thing is, our stakeholders want us to answer those 2 questions. They need us to answer those 2 questions. They've got business cases to evaluate. They've got investment proposals to present, and they've got penny pinching paper pushers they need to appease. So they need to know how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take in order for your project to get approved. Even if you're internal, developing within your own organization, your manager and your leadership is going to want to know, which kind of work that you should be doing. They'll direct you as to which type of projects have a good ROI based on how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. And certainly if you're outside, like a Microsoft partner or working for Microsoft, you're going to be evaluated, and the customer's got some options. They might be evaluating your proposal versus somebody else's, and you need to be pretty accurate with those. If it was my business, I wouldn't approve a project unless you could tell me how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. So there's a movement in Agile you might be familiar with called no estimates, #no estimates. And they believe that the best approach to answering that is to not answer it at all. What they would have us do is to build a few features and then use the data that we gathered while building those features to create a probabilistic forecast about how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take to build the rest of the features. Very similarly, the way that the meteorological offices collect lots of data about weather, and then they use supercomputers in order to try and predict, based on the circumstances right now, what the future weather is going to look like. The trouble is that we don't have any data. Like when we're pitching a business apps project to a potential customer, we've probably never worked with them before. And we've built similar apps, but we haven't built this app for them. And so, we don't have the ability to create probabilistic forecasts. So let's not pretend we can. We can't. So estimating is not forecasting. Estimating is kind of essential. We've said that we need it. Our stakeholders need it. But is it a valuable activity? I'm not really sure it is. Nobody's ever said, I want to spend more time estimating. Nobody's ever looked back at a project and said, that project would have gone much better if we just spent 3 times as much effort in our estimates. It's a necessary activity, but it's not a directly valuable one. We want to get on with the fun stuff, building apps that our users love. So let's produce reasonably accurate estimates to answer those 2 questions and help us make good decisions as quickly as we can. Some good things that do come out of estimating. One of those I've often found is a shared understanding. The developers get to know more about what the users want and need. The users get to know a little bit more about how Microsoft Dynamics or the Power Platform works. And so we're building up that shared understanding during that discovery work. We get some diverse perspectives. If you're doing it right, you've got a team involved, not just one person, not just one analyst or one architect or lead developer doing your estimating, but you've also got testers and makers and analysts and product owners and subject matter experts all in those workshops, bringing together the diverse perspectives. My favorite is always one of my testers looks at the security requirements and goes, yeah, okay, well, you can configure a security role pretty quickly in some business units, but it's going to take me days to test all of those scenarios. There's a lot of negative testing to do when it comes to security. And quite often as an application maker, I don't think that way. So I miss out on the testing effort. It also gets the team to buy in. If the team is generating estimates for this project, they feel bought into the requirements, bought into their estimates. Certainly there's a bit of commitment there from the team. So if you're using the same team to create the estimates as they're going to implement the application, I quite often find that there's a greater sense of commitment. So I'm going to share with you my method for quickly, accurately, and confidently answering the 2 little questions that we always get. How much and how long? The method I use is based on story point estimation. It's been around in agile software development for a little while. It's not an official part of Scrum, which I'm a big fan of. Scrum really doesn't say much about estimation. In fact, it says nothing about estimation in the latest Scrum guide. It's worked really well for me, like I said, for at least the last 10 years. We're winning more and more projects using this method today. Customers really appreciate how quickly we can get to some reasonably accurate estimates. My old way of doing it, maybe this is your way today, is to do lots of analysis in advance. We conduct heaps of workshops, weeks and weeks. We're going to interview lots of people. We're going to analyze lots of existing data in the existing systems. We're going to write everything down in excruciating detail. We're going to try and get the users to sign off on everything. And if I miss anything, if I forget anything or overlook anything, the customer's going to get a nasty change request later. So I really have to get it right first time. After we get all the requirements nailed down and we pretend that nothing's going to change, we go into the design mode. So we think about all the apps and tables and forms and views and columns and flows and plugins and add-ons and integrations that are going to be required. And then we think about all the non-functional stuff that's going to be required as well, performance and usability and storage and operations and maintainability and supportability and all the quality criteria. That all goes into our design, and we produce wads of design documentation, and we ask our customer to sign it off. They've never done Dynamics or Power Platform work before, so they have no idea what any of this means. But as long as they sign it off, we're happy. And then we get our project manager to break it all down into little 15-minute increments, or maybe 1-hour increments, and lay it all out in a Gantt chart with lots of dependencies, and we assign people to do all the tasks, and there's a chain of critical dependencies and how that's a critical path and the minimum amount of time the project's going to take. We add up all the resources that we've got on there and all their billable rates and figure out how much it's going to cost. The result, how does that end? According to Steve McConnell, who's a renowned software development author, he reckons that only 75% of projects are delivered within 25% of their original estimates. And that only includes the projects that finished. Quite a few projects never finish. They get cancelled because they're so overrun that their sponsor pulls the plug and cuts them off. Why are estimates so bad? Why do they blow out so much? Well, there's a few laws in software development, and some of these are pretty tongue-in-cheek, but hopefully they resonate with you and might give you a giggle. Parkinson's law. Anybody who's ever packed a suitcase to go on vacation knows this one. Work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. If I have an hour to pack for a 2-week vacation in Hawaii, I can do it. I'm pretty motivated. I'll get my suitcase packed in an hour. If I leave myself a couple of days, it'll take a couple of days. Similarly, when we're building a component on the Power Platform, it tends to take however long we thought it would take. We seem to be able to get it done pretty quickly if we're under pressure, or we inflate the amount of time it takes if we're given lots of time to do it. Hofstadter's law, one of my favorites. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. Berard's law 13, what Berard said, walking on water and developing software against a written specification. They're both easy if they're both frozen. I'm not going to break into song. This is not a Disney movie. Humphrey's law, my wife knows this one well. The user doesn't know what she wants until she sees your first attempt. I suffered this one quite a lot as we were renovating our house, and especially when you're trying to choose colors of paint, for example. And this happens to all of our users. The best way to elicit the requirements is actually to show our users a prototype or an MVP or a proof of concept and get their feedback. It's far better than trying to write it down on a piece of paper and say, is this really what you want? Seeing it come to life, giving you feedback is a much better way of satisfying Humphrey's law. Zipf's law, the requirements will never be fully understood, certainly when we're working with complex applications. Wagner's lemma, Wagner said an interactive system can never be fully specified or tested. And we also suffer from what I call executives' wild dreams. This is when the leadership who've got no notion of building complex business applications decree that a project must be finished by a certain date or under a certain amount of money. They pluck these numbers out of thin air, and we suffer for that. The other thing that happens is, how do I put this politely? Our well-meaning sales or business development teams take the delivery team's estimates and adjust them without their knowledge in order to try and meet the customer's budget. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. And one of my favorites is outside estimators, also known as solution architects. When the people who are creating the estimates are not the ones delivering the work, but the ones doing the work are going to get blamed for not being able to meet the estimates. I love the delivery team estimating the work, not somebody in pre-sales, Lord help us, or a solution architect. And the other thing that we often see, particularly towards the end of projects, is requirement stuffing. The schedule is fixed, we're going live, it's in the calendar, the training's kind of underway, and a new requirement emerges. And somebody says, well, we just have to fit it in. The original schedule, the schedule's not going to change, the budget's not going to change, you just need to fit this extra requirement somewhere into your Gantt chart. Estimating in time, not to say it doesn't work, but quite often it doesn't work. More often than not, it doesn't work. You might be used to estimating tasks in units of time, like hours or days. It's especially true for Microsoft partners, not because I don't think it's the best way to estimate work, but it tends to be the way that we invoice work. Please don't let how you invoice for stuff determine how you estimate stuff. That's kind of the tail wagging the dog. Here are 4 problems that most teams face when they're estimating in units of time. The amount of work I can get done in my day isn't the same amount of work that Michael Ochs can get done in his day. I'm sure we'd all like to have developers like Michael Ochs in our team, but I wouldn't want Mike estimating the work, because he estimates not in hours or days, but probably seconds, right? And and his estimates, while true for him, they're not true for me. I can't get that component built in seconds. So I don't want Michael Ochs estimating the work, because the amount of work that different developers can get done in a period of time is different. So when we estimate in time, we're thinking, how long would it take me to build the feature? Well, I might not be the one building that feature. It might be somebody else in our team. So the counter to that is to think about how long it'll take the average developer, in air quotes. How long will it take the average developer to do the work? Well, all we do then is we fudge it. We think, I'm 50% slower than the average developer, so I'll just take all my estimates of how long it would take me and I'll fudge it by 50%. Well, that's just taking the same problem and tweaking it. So we're not going to do that. We don't want to think about how much slower or faster we are than the average developer. All we've done is take a bad guess and make it worse. The other thing about time-based estimates is they're really fragile. I've seen teams have to re-estimate all the work that they've done or yet to do if there's a big change. If, for example, the ALM process changes, or a key person leaves the team, or somebody new comes onto the team, you have to re-estimate everything all over again. And that's just time spent estimating, we've said, is not particularly valuable time. So we want to find a way of creating estimates where we don't have to do re-estimates. And that's what I think story point estimation does for us. And the other thing about time-based estimates is that they don't include waiting time. You ever had to wait for somebody to create a service account, or a business analyst to clarify a requirement with one of the subject matter experts, or I'm waiting for that other team to develop the API that I need? There's lots of reasons why we're stuck waiting around on a project. That waiting time is hardly ever included in our estimate. We didn't anticipate waiting time. We're far more optimistic than that when we do our estimates. There's 1,000 reasons why we might have to wait for stuff, and we think, oh, while I'm waiting for that thing to become unblocked, I'll start this other thing over here. Well, there's a context switching cost every time we do that, and then we have to come back to the original thing once we're unblocked, and I have to switch back into it again. And that second thing that we started, we probably didn't finish, so we'll have to switch back into that again. And so that context switching has a huge overhead as well, and causes us to blow out our estimates. So if estimating in time-based units like hours or days is too concrete, perhaps we're better to switch to something a little bit more abstract. How about estimating in t-shirts? I don't know if anybody here works for Power Objects. This is a Power Objects t-shirt given out at a conference a couple of years ago. It's massive. I think it was at XL. This is my little fellow wearing it. T-shirt estimates sometimes go in extra small, medium, large, extra large. The thing is, or we can use animals, mice, cats, dogs, ponies, and horses. What happens when you tell your project stakeholder that it's going to take 3 smalls, 4 mediums, 5 larges, and 3 extra larges to get the project done? Well, what does that even mean? Are you going to be able to say that with a straight face? I'm not sure I could. What you end up doing is converting the t-shirt sizes to numbers behind the scenes so that you can add everything up, and it comes to 41. So if you're going to use numbers, if you're going to end up with numbers, why not just use numbers in the first place? Like, our developers are pretty smart, right? So let's have them use some numbers. Okay, where are we at? Estimates are different from forecasts, and they're different from commitments. When we think about when we're estimating, we're asked to produce estimates at the start of the project, or even before it has started. It's at that point of the project where we know least about the customer, least about the users, least about their requirements. They know least about Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform apps that we're going to be building. They don't even know what what apps and tables and views and columns and things are, let alone be able to express what they need. So we're going to be estimating at the point of peak ignorance when we're standing on top of Mount Stupid. This is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. We don't even know what we don't know. Our estimates at this stage are not forecast. Like I said, they're not a probabilistic forecast. You can get there with something called running tested stories. There's a guy in the no estimates movement called Vasco Duarte. If you're interested in no estimates, and you're able to do some work before you have to estimate the rest of the work, check out Vasco's work. But what we want to do is to be able to estimate. This is what an estimate looks like. We estimate the cost is going to be somewhere between 2.2 and 2.6 million. We estimate the duration is going to be 6.5 to 8 months. Now, that's a pretty reasonable estimate. There's a range of cost and duration there. If that was a forecast where there's a lot more certainty, it would sound like we are 80% confident that the cost is going to be 800K to 900K and it's going to take 4 to 5 sprints. You can see when we're producing forecasts, typically the ranges are smaller, the costs and durations are smaller because it's easier to make more accurate predictions about smaller things. But if we're going to make a commitment would be, absolutely nothing's going to stop us getting it done by the end of this sprint. I'm not a big fan of commitments. So I try and estimate with guesstimates, right? It's a reasonably accurate, but not completely precise range of costs and durations. I'm going to share a story with you about trail running and why I think estimating in story points is a bit like going trail running, particularly with my wife, if you ever had that opportunity. She's an awesome trail runner. 10 years ago, I was running barefoot, ultra marathon mountain trails. These days, she's far fitter and faster than me. One of the places we love running, and she runs a couple of times a week, is Mount Cootha. It's a mountain here on the edge of Brisbane, and her favorite trail there is called the Powerful Owl Trail. When I asked her to estimate how long it would take both of us to run it together, she said it would take about an hour. Took us about an hour and a half. What happened? I'm not that slow, surely. Well, she's an experienced trail runner. She's done Cootha dozens and dozens of times. When I asked her to estimate the trail, she estimated in a unit of time, just like a lot of us do when we're estimating business applications. Another approach she could have taken would be to compare the Powerful Owl Trail to other trails that we've run together. The Cootha Loop via the Powerful Owl Trail is 8 kilometers, about 5 miles, if that's your metric. Natasha runs mountain trails at about 8 kilometers an hour. My speed is more like 6 when it's flat. So when we include the 278 meters of elevation, that's about 800 feet, and the creeks we had to jump across and the treacherous conditions of some of the trails because of the recent rain, it's no wonder it took us an hour and a half. If Natasha had told me that it's an 8 with several steep climbs, some creeks and some muddy trails, we could have agreed to call it a 13 because we would have taken the distance and adjusted it for all those other factors that make it harder than a regular 8K run on the flat. Another trail we like is the Kokoda Trail. It's slightly longer, 10 kilometers, and much more elevation, about 50% more. So it's a little bit longer and significantly steeper than Powerful Owl. So if the Powerful Owl is a 13, the Kokoda is more like a 20. And that's all that story points are. They're a generic unit for estimating the size of one requirement compared to the size of another requirement based on an agreed scale. So if your teams ever have a hard time remembering story points, you come back to the trail running analogy and hopefully that works. It's a risk-adjusted size of a piece of work. So let's unpack the size of a requirement and the factors that affect the size of a requirement. Almost all of what goes into a requirement is effort. The amount of work you have to do to get it done. That's the analysis, the design, the build, the test, deploying it, validating it, documenting it, all of that work that you need to do in order to get from an idea into production. We measure effort in time, but we also want to adjust it based on the risk, the complexity, and some other factors as well. So when we factor in, just like our when we go trail running, we've got this scale of easy, moderate, strenuous, hard, and hazardous. We also want to factor in the risk, uncertainty, and complexity of our requirements. So risks might include business risks like mergers or acquisitions that might change things, changes in industry regulation or government legislation, changes in the competitive landscape, or changes in your leadership. Or a very common one is changes in our team. We have people who have got critical skills in our team or in another team. Uncertainty is things like the amount of data that needs to come through our system, or how many times a certain process will run per day, or how many users we're going to have, or how many web visits we're going to have, or how many flows are going to run, how many products we're going to have of different categories. We might not know that when we set out. And we've got some complexity, things like novel technologies. We've never used artificial intelligence. We never used the Azure AI service before, so we're going to need to account for some complexity when we're dealing with a brand new service. We want to build a custom rules engine, or can we buy a rules engine? Or we've got some, we've never used that new subscription billing feature in Dynamics 365 Finance before. So there's some complexity in our projects as well. So when we add all of those things in, and we think about, are there any risks, any uncertainties, or any complexity relating to this requirement, we need to factor that into our estimates. Give you an example. Imagine a small requirement takes 30 hours. That's the amount of effort required. There's low risk, little uncertainty, and low complexity. It's well understood. We've done this a dozen times before. It's a simple, maybe a simple custom table that we're going to add to an application. We call it a 30-point requirement, 30 hours, 30 points. We've done a 1-for-1. But imagine another requirement that we also think will take about 30 hours. But the business analyst still needs to check some of the details regarding a couple of the edge cases that we need to satisfy. We're not quite sure whether the integration is going to be real-time or scheduled. We're also going to need approval from the integration board, who kind of approve kind of novel integrations, and we're not sure what their approval schedule looks like. The product owner also needs approval from the owner of the target system that we're going to be integrating with, and she hasn't heard from him in a few weeks. It's potentially the same amount of work if everything goes well, but we've just highlighted some risks, uncertainty, and complexity involved in this second requirement. They're both 30 hours on a good day. First one, we've got lots of experience, and it's taken 30 hours for all of them. This one, we're not so sure. So we could call that one a 50-point requirement. What we've done is just accommodate the effort and adjust it based on risk, uncertainty, and complexity. So story points are that relative measure of risk-adjusted effort. When it comes to estimation scales, you could use a 1 to 100 scale, but I don't like using scales like that. There's two scales I'm going to show you that my teams, well, actually one scale that my teams work with, another scale that I've got some other Microsoft partners who use a different scale. The reason why we like using an estimation scale, and I recommend agreeing an estimation scale, there's a couple of laws again. So let's look at Hicks' law. The more choices you have, the longer it takes. If we have an estimation scale of 1 to 100, that's 100 choices, and it'll take a lot longer for developers to choose the estimate compared to a scale where there's 5 or 6 different choices. Natasha, my trail running wife, used to work at GlaxoSmithKline in their consumer healthcare division, and they had a goal of removing a toothpaste from their lineup every time they wanted to launch a new toothpaste, because consumer feedback was nobody likes spending more time choosing toothpaste, which is true, but doesn't explain why there's 5,000 different toothpastes to choose from in the supermarket. Don't give your teams too many options. Weber's law is of just noticeable differences. I don't know why it's called Weber's law, because the guy who coined it is actually a psychophysicist called Gustav Fechner. Fechner asserted that the minimum reliable detectable difference between two weights, when we think of mass, is about 5%. If we had an estimation scale of 1 to 100, then we'd have a choice to make about whether this requirement is a 50-point requirement or a 51-point requirement. And the difference between those two is only 2%. Our brain can't reliably choose between them because the difference is less than 5%. So taking those two laws into account, Hicks' law and Weber's law, we have two popular estimating scales. One is the power of 2 scale, powers of 2. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. Yeah, I always think of buying RAM for my computer when I used to build my own computers. 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, and so on. You're welcome to use the powers of 2 scale, but most of my teams use this scale, which is the modified Fibonacci scale. I don't know if anybody remembers Fibonacci from their high school physics or biology even. This is the modified Fibonacci scale that my teams use, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. That is actually not a modified Fibonacci, that's just Fibonacci. Where we modify it is when we come to estimate features and epochs. So I tend to estimate features and epochs at the start of a project. I don't want to break it down into tiny user stories in that 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8 scale. I want to stick at a pretty high level when I'm thinking about an entire project. So I use this scale, 13, 20, 40, 60, and 100. So the 13 is a carryover from the previous Fibonacci run, and we just rounded them off to make it easier to count. We can also use a similar scale for estimating entire applications. Sometimes you need to estimate how long it's going to, the relative effort in a portfolio of small Power Apps, for example. We quite often see this in app factories. If you have an internal team who are just churning out app after app after app, what's the relative size of each of those? You can use this kind of scale up here. So this Fibonacci scale, I use this for user stories. The true Fibonacci scale is 13, 21, 34, 55, and 89, but it's really hard to count. And it also gives our stakeholders an illusion of precision that we actually don't really have. So we use this modified scale instead. When it comes to estimating stories, it's pretty important to get the right size. So we're going to use the scale 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. Some requirements are too small. Changing a column name, it's just such a trivial amount of effort. It's not worth writing a story for that, and it's not worth spending any time estimating it. So what we're going to do with stories that are too small is aggregate them, just combine them all together and have a UI enhancements story with a bunch of label changes or moving fields around on forms or changing the color of a button, and gather all those together and estimate them in aggregate. We can have stories that are too big. I like to stick within that 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8 range. So I slice stories that we think are bigger than an 8, and we slice them up into something smaller because we want to get lots of stories done within a sprint. Big stories also carry too much risk, uncertainty, and complexity. So it's another good reason to slice them. How do you know when they're small enough? I think if you can get at least 10 items done in a sprint as a team, and that's a reasonable size. And if you've got 8 developers in a team or 2 developers in a team, you'll end up with different sized stories. But trying to get about 10 of them done in a sprint, it feels to me about the right size. Let's take an example. Here's a requirement called inquiry management. This is for a university. To help students quickly receive correct answers to inquiries, as a student services officer, I can track cases from different sources through a consistent case management process through to resolution within 1 business day. So we've got our persona there. It's the student services officer, and we've got the goal, and we've also got the functionality that they need. So inquiry management is too big. We couldn't deliver that in 1 sprint. It's bigger than an 8-point user story. So we want to split it up. So we're going to split it up into some smaller user stories called case submission, case writing, case evaluation, case resolution, case escalation, and case service levels. So that's, 6 smaller user stories that together make up inquiry management. If you're using something like Azure DevOps, inquiry management is a feature or maybe an epic, and these others are user stories. When you're splitting stories, a good question to ask yourself is each of the stories independently valuable? Being able to submit a case and being able to write a case are both independently valuable. If I had to, I could manually write cases before the automated case writing feature was built, so I could release one before the other. Now, you might not want to do that. You might want to release them all together. That's a release decision that your product owner can make, as long as you've independently built the stories. If I did it a different way and sliced them kind of horizontally, if I think about slicing it, I'm going to do the UI and I'm going to do the validation, and then I'm going to save to Dataverse. And sometime later, I'm going to create a security role to allow somebody to interact with this feature. That's a poor slicing strategy, because nobody can use the case submission feature until those 4 user stories are done. So they're not independently valuable. So try not to slice them horizontally. Think about slicing them vertically. If that makes any sense. Whose job is it to write user stories, to split user stories? In my teams, it's always the product owner. The product owner is always accountable for the backlog, and she always owns the contents and is responsible for splitting the stories. But don't know about your projects, but in mine, our product owner is not a business apps expert. Quite often it's her first business applications project. She's never been a product owner before. She's got very little experience as she's not from a product management career. She might be the sales director or the head of customer service, and she's got an operational job, an operational expertise. That's why we want her involved in building the backlog. But one of the developers in my team will typically come from a business analysis background, and they're the ones monkeying around inside the backlog, helping the product owner split stories and refine stories and add acceptance criteria and so on. So you might see that pattern in your teams, particularly if you're using an agile approach. Product owner, business expertise, approves things, oversees the backlog, but the business analyst is doing most of the work. Next step in our method is for our team to agree a standard user story. This is going to be the one that we compare all the other user stories to that first one. So is it bigger? Is it smaller? We think about the standard. To do this, I find a reasonably small user story that's valuable, that's well understood, and that's quite low risk as our standard user story. So we've discussed it, we know the acceptance criteria for it, and there's no significant unknowns associated with this standard user story. It's our Goldilocks story, right? It's not too big, not too small, not too hot, and not too cold. We're going to use that as our standard. We want to be able to get, like I said, about 10 of those standard stories done in one sprint. So I normally call that standard story a 3-point user story. That's the kind of the anchor in our estimation scale. If the comparison story requires a lot less effort than our risk-adjusted standard story, then it's a 1-point story. If it's a little bit less, it's a 2. If it's a little bit more, it's a 5. And if it's a lot more, it's an 8. And if it feels like it's more than 3 times the size of our standard story, well, then it's bigger. It's a feature, and we're going to need to split that feature down. So an advanced technique we can do is have a standard story for each unit in our scale. Here's a standard 1-point story, or a couple of standard 1-point stories. Here's a couple of standard 2-point stories. So when we come up with a new requirement, we can look at it and say, which of these does it feel most like? Well, it looks like a 5. It's got the same amount of effort. It's got similar risk to some of those other 5-point stories. If you're co-located, you can print out those standard user stories and stick them to a wall. If you're remote, you can have a wiki document highlighting some of your standard user stories. Remember to include that, that wiki page or show that wall to a new developer who's joining your team during their onboarding, so they get a feel for how your estimates work. Now you've got your standard user story. How are you going to estimate everything else in your backlog? So you're at the start of a project. You've got an initial product backlog. Nothing is estimated except your standard. Two techniques you can use. Affinity estimation is the first one. Here's how affinity estimation works. You have columns representing all the units in your scale, and there's your standard user story in the middle. It's the 3-point case submission, and we've got all these other stories in our backlog that we're going to estimate. What we do is take one of the developers steps up to the wall or the board and grabs one of the unestimated user stories and puts them in a column. There's no collaboration, no talking. We're working together, but alone. Next developer picks up the next story, any of the other stories, and puts it in a column. We finish all of that. Once all of the unestimated stories are now in a column, we spend a few more minutes moving estimates around. So if I didn't like where somebody had put the case escalation, I thought it was not an 8, I could move it into the 5. Now we can have a little debate, because there's obviously a bit of difference of opinion, and we can have a short debate, 30 seconds or a minute tops. We time box it. We get the product owner involved if there's anything we need to clarify, but we spend a few minutes just finalizing our estimates. So affinity estimation works really well under a couple of circumstances. I like to use affinity estimation when there's lots of user stories to estimate. It's great at quickly estimating a big pile of user stories, maybe at the start of a project or at the start of a new release. And when you've got, it works well, even if you've got quite a, I'd say it works well regardless of the number of developers you have in your team, whether it's 2, 3, or 8 or 10 developers. Affinity estimation works reasonably well. Affinity estimation doesn't really require any special tools or apps. It works well with Post-it notes or index cards, or you can use a Miro, Microsoft Word, Whiteboard, whatever online tools if you're collaborating. The second technique is planning poker, probably a little bit more popular. You might have heard of planning poker. Let me run you through it really quickly. It's based on techniques that go way back to the 60s, actually, called wideband Delphi techniques. So what we do is a product owner typically will pick up one of the user stories, or the business analyst if the product owner is not there, and spend a moment describing it. So user story 141, send broadcast emails. As a marketer, I can send broadcast email messages so that da-da-da-da-da. The developers then have a chance to clarify. They ask about dependencies or acceptance criteria or who the stakeholders are. And then they're going to silently estimate, using our predefined scale, how big they think this story is compared to our standard user story on a risk-adjusted basis. And they reveal those estimates simultaneously. And the reason that we do this silent estimation and simultaneous reveal is to prevent anchoring, which is when one person shouts out their estimate, and that anchors everybody else's brain. And particularly if they're less experienced than the person who shouted out their estimate, it can bias everybody else. So we want to avoid that bias by silently estimating and then simultaneously revealing. These differences of opinion are great. They give us a chance to find out why Batman thought it was a 5. Well, Batman is the quality manager, of course, and he always remembers all of the different negative scenarios we need to test. Robin is the apprentice in our team and thinks it's a 1 because Robin doesn't have a lot of experience. So Robin's always over-optimistic about how long things are going to take. And so we get a great chance to discuss the basis of our estimates. You can use time boxes to constrain that discussion. It can drag out. My experience, particularly with new teams, is that planning poker can take a long time. So you might need to get your scrum masters to facilitate planning poker using time boxes to help you keep the pace going. And for that reason, I think planning poker works when there's only a few stories to estimate. A dozen or so, maybe 20. My team's use planning poker every sprint. We have a backlog refinement workshop to look at further down the backlog at work we're going to be doing next sprint or 2 or 3 sprints ahead. We're splitting those stories, discussing them, refining them, adding acceptance criteria. And at the end of those workshops, we're estimating any unestimated items that we feel are ready. And there's normally 5, 6, 8 of those. It's a good time to use planning poker. Planning Poker does benefit from using some planning poker tools. You can use a deck of regular playing cards if you're meeting in person. In a pinch, I've used the app on my phone, a calculator app, and just typed the number in and then flipped it around. So you don't need any special tools if you're in person. If you're collaborating remotely, there's lots of different apps on the Apple App Store or Google Play Store if you want to use a planning poker app. There's even planning poker apps you can add in to Jira or Azure DevOps. So you might benefit from some tools there. Today, just to keep it really simple, we're using Teams. My developers will just count down 3, 2, 1, go, and they all type their number in the chat at the same time. And that seems to work well enough for us. It's nice and quick. So you've now got these two estimation methods. How do you figure out how long things are going to take? So we're going to use story point estimation when we're estimating our product backlog. Usually every couple of months, we're going to figure out how long things are going to take. So what I'd like to do is to split our user stories down so that they're small enough so we can implement 10 stories in one sprint. We take the top 10 in the product backlog, and it works best if they're related to the same epic or the same big feature. And we're going to take those top 10 stories together, and we're going to figure out if we can get them all done in one sprint. So these have all been estimated. The top 10 all have story point estimates against them relative to the standard. Do we feel like we could get all 10 of them done in one sprint? And to do that, we use a game called Fist of 5. Really simple. 0 fingers means no way we could get it done. 5 means absolutely we could get all 10 done. 4 means probably. 3 means might. 2 means probably not. And 1 means no chance. And 0 means forget it. So you play Fist of 5, and if all the developers think that yes, 4 or 5, that means we can get all those 10 done. So we add another one in. What's the 11th story in the product backlog? Could we get 11 stories done? Well, we'd play Fist of 5 again, and we're probably less confident. There's probably some 3s and 4s. If nobody's showing a 5 and most people are starting to show 3s, then we have to stop and we say, look, we could probably get 11 done, but not 12. In this example here, we've got 45 user stories in the backlog. They've been estimated. They're between 1 and 8 points each. And the total for the entire backlog is 125 points. So pretty small. The team has decided, using the Fist of 5 game to measure their confidence, they can get 9 stories done in one sprint. Not 10, they dropped 1. They think they can get 9 done. The total for those 9 was 25 story points if you add them all up. So 25 is their predicted velocity. So if you've done any kind of agile work, you might be familiar with the term velocity. This is a good method for estimating the team's initial velocity. They've never built anything yet. When we start to build stuff, we get real data, then we can get a real velocity going. And after a couple of sprints, we get an average velocity. That helps us be much more accurate. But right at the start, we need to predict our velocity. We need to estimate it. So we take the backlog, 125 points. We divide that by our estimated velocity of 25 points per sprint. And so we now estimate it'll take 5 sprints. Anybody who remembers their physics, this is the distance divided by the time, distance divided by velocity equals speed. So what we've said here, it's going to take 5 2-week sprints, which is about 10 weeks. So now we can tell our product owner, when she asks us, how long will it take? We can tell her it's going to take 10 weeks. If you want to take my estimating course, you'll find out how to turn weeks into cost, but it's pretty easy if you're running an agile team because we tend to have a very predictable cost per sprint or cost per week. It's quite a consistent burn rate, and you can easily convert time into money. So quick recap, how I estimate. I have Goldilocks user stories in that kind of 1 to 8 point range. I agree a standard user story with the team. We use affinity estimation or planning poker to estimate all the stories in our backlog. We estimate our velocity by starting with 10 and then using the Fist of 5 game to check our confidence. And from there, we derive the duration of how long it's going to take. There's lots more to learn in the Estimating Business Apps course. Go and check that out. It's, at least the first 3 sections are free. You can take the advanced plan if you want to get into more of the sales proposals and estimating entire applications and so on, and how to visualize your estimates. I've been Neil Benson. I think, Aidan, we might just come in under the hour. And I'd like to encourage you all to keep sprinting. Thanks very much.